format. We don't have to be quite so formal. So we also give the public a chance to raise their hand at any point throughout the different items. So folks can feel free to raise their hand now to speak generally, or after each one of the presentations, we'll also give folks a chance to weigh in if they would like. And I'm not seeing anybody raising their hand now, but again, if that changes, happy to give folks a chance to comment. So our next item after that is the public hearing for the Vermont Community Development Program. And we'll start with licensed nursing assistant training program and then go to the ventilation improvement program. I assume that staff is ready. I don't want to put them on the spot, but to give a quick presentation before we go to public comment. So I'm not 100% sure who to turn to or who's doing which presentation, but happy to hand it over.
I think Jillian's going to give the LNA update, and I believe Chanel is going to give the ventilation improvement program update. Is that correct, folks? I got that right? Okay, great.
Awesome.
But we're all here as to hopefully be help to the committee.
Fantastic.
And the public.
Thank you. And I'll hand it over to you, Gillian.
Right. I just need to get up my, I have a couple of slides to share, and I just need to get them up. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Good. Yeah, all right. So my name is Jillian Nanton, and I was the project manager on the licensed nursing assistant workforce training project. As I said, I have a few slides, and I think I could go through them fairly quickly. By way of a little bit of background, this project was developed, I would say, in the height of the pandemic. In fact, when I started to discuss with the University of Vermont Medical Center to get a sense of their openings in the healthcare field, this was in the summer of 2020. Project was developed, and in fact, it was launched in May of 2021. And so it's about 16, 17 months, and will conclude at the end of the year. The project came about. We know that low-income BIPOC immigrants and refugees suffered disproportionately on account of the pandemic. There were major job losses. And so it was felt that a free, short-term, intensive training program could offer opportunities, career advancements to these low-income folks in the healthcare sector. In parallel with that, we know that the healthcare sector too has a huge deficit in terms of openings, and that's still the case. So that's kind of the framing for the program. So there are a number of key things I'd like to touch on in the presentation. They're up on the slides there. I'll say something about the key features and components of the program. I'll review achievements and implementation. This project met with a lot of headwinds. In the third bullet there, we'll deal with the challenges and problems encountered. And then I pull out some best practices and lessons learned, and then I share some financial information. And then if there are any questions, I'll attempt to answer those. So these are some of the key features of the project. We know what the name is, and I say also known as Moving On, Moving Up. The implementing agency for this project was our TLC Home Care. CEDA was the coordinating and reporting entity. As I said, it started on 7th May 2021, and it will end in a couple of weeks. In fact, there was a formal launch of this program on the 9th of June, right, in which a number of partners came together to launch this program. And I'll talk a little bit about the partnerships a little later on in the presentation. But we've had good support from some of the key healthcare agencies, UVMMC, Cathedral Square, residents of Ethan Allen, same TLC Home Care, And so it was kind of all hands on deck, but Cedar was the principal and lead on this project. So the project had, the major component was the LNA training, which had 3 components. To that, there was a theory component, which was done remotely. We're in a pandemic. So that was 10 weeks of training for folks. Then there was 15 hours of labs and 32 hours of paid clinicals for the students in the program. The program, I have to tell you, was overly subscribed. We had about 120 plus applicants, and we in fact enrolled 42 persons in the program. So it was delivered in 5 separate training cohorts of about 7 to 9 students, right? And so another piece of the program which was built in was what I call personal and professional development. Resource delivered this component. And again, we are talking here about soft skills, which is a very important dimension of programs, the time management, critical thinking, problem solving, oral communication. This is some of what the students learned in that 6 hours of training. We also helped them to prepare their resumes, prepare for interviews. So, and they actually got a certificate of completion from Resource after the 6 hours. After the 6 hours was completed. The other thing that I built into this was a couple of training sessions on what I call diversity, equity, and inclusion. Students attended that, but I think also importantly here too were for managers and supervisors who attended that. Those 2 sessions, one was held at Ethan Allen Residence. We had about 25 attendees, including supervisors and managers. The other one was held at Cathedral Square, and a similar number of participants in that program. So let me go quickly then to the achievements. The goals again of this were broadly to train 40 persons from Burlington's underserved populations. By and large, the vast majority, well, nearly, I would say 96, 97% of the students were really immigrants and refugees who participated. And the second broad goal was to increase the capacity of healthcare services in care institutions. I talked about the deficit of workers there. And this included training on infection disease responses too as well. Of course, this project was funded from state monies and particularly a bucket of resources for COVID. So the total number of students enrolled were 42 students. 35 completed the 3-part training. I talked about this, the 3-part training being the theory, the labs, and the paid 32 hours of clinicals. And the total number of students who actually sat for the LNA exams were 23. As you see, there's a gap between the 23 and 35. There's a little bit of a storyline here. I'll come to that in a minute. But this slide gives you a sense of a more complete picture of the achievements. So you see the 5 cohorts there. 35 completed, as I said, which would be about 83% of the 42. 23 who sat for the LNA, about 66% of that 35. So the numbers that got the LNA certificate now from the state were 12, which would be about 52% of 23. You would see kind of a huge delta between those who passed the skills, 83%, and that 65%. There were a certain proportion of students who were challenged, right? And whose English levels of proficiency perhaps were not what they should be. And so there was a little bit of struggle with the theory portion of the test. But I highlighted the red there, cohort 3, because one of the very amazing and unbelievable things that happened with this program in the middle of delivering this program, the vendor who administers the test was in fact changed. Now, typically it was the American Red Cross that administered across the state of Vermont the LNA test. The Red Cross withdrew at the end of October. So those cohorts 1 and 2, where you see we had pretty good results, they did it under the aegis of the Red Cross. And so midstream, we had a new testing agency, and they took quite a while to gear up. They took months, in fact, to gear up between when the Red Cross withdrew at the end of October and when Prometric, the new vendor, was able to get online. And so that happened the 1st of April of this year. And so you had a long interregnum between when students actually finished their coursework and when they were actually able to get test dates. Well, to register first, right, with Prometric and to get test dates. And I'm coming to talk a little bit about the challenges, but I felt it important when you look at the slide to take that into account. The bottom piece of the slide gives a sense of the folks who actually were supported in the program. And you would see that 40% of the students were actually extremely low income. That's 30% or less of the median income, another 34% very low, and 26% low income. That's the 80% of your income, HUD income limits. So let me just go quickly then to the challenges and the problems encountered. I've touched on some of this already, but I want to highlight the fact that some of the program was delayed because of what was happening with COVID. So you had some of the labs having to be rescheduled because students did, in fact, some of them got COVID. Some of the clinicals had to be rescheduled because some of the residents did in fact have COVID, the residents at Shelburne Bay. So again, those dimensions of the course had to be deferred, if you will. And a couple of instructors themselves had COVID. So that was one of the problems encountered. I touched already on the change in vendor administering the LNA test. And this had a number of cascading effects, right? I mentioned before the months-long delay between course completion and testing. And in fact, as a consequence, one lost about 10 students, right, who lost interest, and 2, in fact, migrated out of state. I touched too on the challenge to get test dates. Even after Prometric got their site up and running on the 1st of April, 2022, there were weeks which passed and folks couldn't get test dates, right, to be able to take the test. So there's a lot of challenge with that change in vendors by the state. And then the other piece of this too, the Prometric tests was somewhat different in teaching materials. And so that cohort 3, which I touched on, they actually were trained using the Red Cross materials, and here now they were being asked to do tests administered by Prometric. The instructors themselves too were a bit challenged because they also had to make adjustments in their teaching curriculum with the students. And I talked about the disenchantment of some students who lost interest. Many, well, not many, about, I would think, about 40%, right, were challenged on the English language proficiency. And there was also too a challenge in identifying instructors, particularly theory. And I think this speaks to the challenge itself, right, in the healthcare sector. So you had several different instructors that delivered the theory portion of this. And so, in fact, this, I think, led to some unevenness in the quality of instruction. In fact, one instructor did quit, right, in the middle of delivering the theory portion for that cohort 3. So cohort 3 did have major issues. I want to talk a little bit about the best practices and lessons learned. There's great interest. North of 120 applications. Up until very recently, there's not a week which passes here at CEDO that somebody doesn't call the front desk asking if the LNA program is still going, how could they access it? Well, the LNA program has for quite a while stopped, right, accepting students. In fact, it's finding that. And this happened with very little marketing, I might tell you, right? Partner institutions, I want to give them a major shout out, right? And Cathedral Square, who I see in the meeting here this evening, right? Because one of the cohorts, cohort 4, the instructor who was supposed to do the clinicals, when she was tested the morning, right? This is in January earlier this year, came down with COVID. And Cathedral Square really stepped up, and so as not to send the students home, because this is 32 hours of clinicals, they actually adjusted their schedule so that they could put on an hour and to support, right, the supervised clinicals for those students. So I want to express publicly my great appreciation to Cathedral Square, right, for how they just jumped in right away. And there were others that were vested too. I talked about Ethan Allen residents, the residents at Shelburne Bay, UVMMC. So all great partners, right, who have called for similar type trainings. The maintenance of the consistency of instructors, if that's possible, I think that's really something that one should strive for. But again, that's a challenge where, you know, there's a deficit of healthcare workers. And I talked a lot about the testing agency. We did do some work with the Vermont Adult Learning to try to bring some of those students who were challenged with the English language. But again, that was not a large budget. So it didn't pay a whole heap of dividends, right? I think any future program should really dedicate, right, some amount of resources, right, to be able to do that in a meaningful way. More on best practices and lessons learned. We did have a program manager who was part-time for some of the duration of the program. From May of last year to end of December, I would suggest any future program should have a full-time manager for the entire duration, housed within the implementing agency. There's a little story there, I wouldn't go into that. But the implementing agency too, right, I think, right, there was need for better understanding of their requirements. Teaching curriculum, there were adjustments which had to be made. I talked about the variability somewhat between the Red Cross teaching curriculum and Prometric. And so some of this had to actually be developed as the program was going along because of the change in stream of the testing agency. And the final point I want to make here is there is a need, right? I think the era cries out, right, for more resources to sustain these programs, great demand for healthcare workers. I see that continuing well into the future, and there are thoughts of looking at, right, a PCA Plus program, a personal care assistant program, which is a little bit of a lower level program where the barriers are not as steep and as rigorous, right, as the LNA, and maybe more suited, if you will, to the immigrant and refugee folks. Very quickly to the financial information. So we got 132,000 and change from the state. This was COVID monies, 132,469. Almost all of that is exhausted, about $200 left back on the table. And then I knew that I would need some resources and would fall short. And so I want to thank my very able director for stepping in, right? And he was able to work his magic and get the Vermont Department of Labor through GBIC to come up with 40,000 to add to the program. So we ended up with that 172,000. and about 6,000 or a little less, right, would be remaining under the program. You have a sense there of the use of funds. The bulk of that, appropriately so, has gone into training. That's about 63% of the total money spent. And then you had the program management piece. I talked about the program manager, that would be about 14%. And then the work, my coordination, oversight, reporting role, which would be about 17% of the funds spent. And then I just give some more detail on the expenditure so you could see what funds were spent on the instructors. It's not rolled up, it's disaggregated here. The students, the paid clinicals, what they received, the soft skills, the DEI training, and the rest of it. And so that's it in a nutshell. I'd entertain any questions, comments, observations, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much for that presentation, and love how many side stories there were in there. I'm sure there's a lot you could talk about. Yeah, so open to members of the public. If folks have questions or comments or anything else, this is the time to raise your hand. And also Joe and Sarah, if you've got questions and comments. Go ahead, Sarah, then Joe.
Yeah, I'm sorry I stepped out for a sec, but it's such a great program. Are we going to sort of try again, or where are we at?
Yeah, most definitely trying again, right? The design of a follow-up program, not the LNA though. This would be a little bit, you know, a step down, what I'm calling the personal care assistant plus program. It's of a shorter duration. Okay. Not as rigorous, and it's not a license. You don't get a license with it, but there's great demand for PCAs, right? As you probably know. And so that's what we're looking at, right? As a follow-on program. Yeah.
What time frame are you looking at?
Okay, so I'm looking at perhaps a launch in March and to have people in seats in April. But the idea is to be able to assemble the resources, and I will, you know, we're working on that. Director Pine, come on, help me here, please.
We are requesting money from our partners at the state first, and then we'll be approaching the mayor for some supplemental funding, perhaps from ARPA, if that is if we deem that that's necessary. Yeah.
Thanks.
Joe, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, Joni, for the presentation. I was working in the State House when this program was talked about in the legislature. And so I understand that it was a pretty large part of the workforce development plan from the state in 2021. And it concerns me that the testing vendor had to change partway through the program. Did the Red Cross decide to stop doing it, or did the state decide to part ways with the Red Cross?
The Red Cross decided to stop doing it. They did in fact withdraw from some other states as well, but they decided, and so then the state of Vermont then had to look right for a new vendor. But it did pose, as I said, major challenges, particularly right for the folks in this program. Yeah,
I would hope that the state learned some of the lessons from what we've seen transpire through the program, because with the interest that we've seen from applicants and clearly knowing that there's so much need out there, I hope that we can keep this going and find some more consistent funding for it.
Yeah, and I'll just add my comments to that. Great. I mean, glad that we were able to make that happen. Seems like it was, I mean, regardless of how it went for some individual folks and, you know, like the difficulty with cohort 4 specifically, I think was experiencing the transition. It does still seem like, I mean, to have that many folks like get through to licensure, which is a real addition to their resume. And I hope, and I'm glad we're pursuing some different things, and I hope that we can almost move forward with both, because I know that there's probably folks who really are more at the where it's like, oh, it'd be great just to do this. I don't know, exact personal care assistant, whatever the exact title was, but some probably who also are more interested in having like at the higher level licensure. And so I think, yeah, hopefully if we pilot one, then we'll have lessons learned and maybe some training curriculum from both that will be easier to pull from.
So that's a very good point, Councillor Hightower, because this kind of easier entry into the PCA, and then of course one could move up the career ladder and go on to be, you know, do higher studies to become an LNA or an LPN or an RN, right? So I think it's, you know, quite, you know, possible, right? That some will go on to the higher level, certifications, right? But I think one, you know, could gain a lot from launching and having a PCA program going, which will, you know, take care of those, you know, folks, if you will, the immigrant and refugee population. As I said, it's a less rigorous program and much needed, you know, in the healthcare industry, PCAs.
There's,
Sorry, one more follow-up question on that is, do we know what the capacity will be for how many folks our goal is for next year, and if we'll reach back out to some of the folks who maybe didn't complete the other training?
So I kind of don't want to get ahead of myself here.
Yeah.
But because it's a shorter program, then of course the cost of instruction, right, to pay instructors is more manageable. And so my expectation is that we'll be able to train, you know, a few dozen folks, right? And perhaps work this too in conjunction with Winooski, because we know that Winooski is home to, you know, a large, you know, population of immigrants and refugees. And when we have to take that route, depending on how the funding comes together, right, for this program. So I'm looking at, a few dozen folks, well, you know, under this program, this new follow-on program to be trained.
Great. Sarah, and then Catherine, I thought I saw your hand up as well.
just a quick comment, because I know there's such a huge demand for one-on-one private care PCAs under the self-directed programs. So I think some follow-up on how does somebody market themselves, so to speak, as a private care PCA, and maybe working with a company like ARIS that does the self-directed care, because it's sort of a whole other niche than working with an agency. And we can talk offline about that, but I think it's something we should pursue.
Thank you.
You kind of touched on my question earlier, but I now have another one. Originally, I was going to ask just if you knew the level of interest compared to the initial for the LNA for the PCA, because I know I work for Cathedral Square. One of our staff went through the program just because she had the opportunity to get a license. So I do worry a little bit about taking that off the table. And then my other question was just in regards to the language piece and kind of the soft skills. I know, a lot of the initial conversation was around the support built around the students and really allowing for problem solving, with childcare and transportation. And I think language is another really important piece of this that other programs for people interested in following this industry just don't offer, and is such a huge part of, I think, what you created here, Jillian, that made it really special and should be considered, because those barriers in life, across the state are a huge part of why I think people try for it, and then it doesn't last, and they can't keep the job or they can't stay in the field.
Yeah, Catherine, thanks for saying that. Any follow-on program will have those components too. In fact, as I said earlier, I see a far more robust, support for the language piece with the Vermont Adult Learning, which was not necessarily the case in this program because of the budget constraints. And the soft skills too will be a component of any new program. Very vital, very important. Childcare, transportation too. Those will all be elements that will come back in any follow-on program for sure. Yeah.
I just wanted to note that the program hopefully will serve as a model and a pilot to show others in the workforce development sector, if you will, and folks at the state level, that this is something that can, in fact, address both the needs for meaningful, decent wage and with benefit jobs, but also the need within the healthcare delivery system and keeping folks living, aging in place. I mean, all of that is tied together here. So it actually meets so many public policy objectives. And it was a very cost-effective way to deliver those, the training. So if you look at that, we're really, I think this presentation that you saw tonight, we need to bring it to the folks at the state level so that they can see it and replicate it and provide enough support to make it really be long-term and sustainable, because the need is only going to grow if you look at the demographic trends of Vermont.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And is it Gillian or Jillian?
Jillian.
Jillian.
Yeah, hi,
Jillian.
yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation and keeping us updated on what's going on. Appreciate you coming in. And I think that means we're switching to, is it Chanel?
Yes. Hi, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Sweet. All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. I, of course, am getting a package delivered right this, just one of those things. All right.
And I don't know if other folks are having this, but you're a little intermittent for me. Okay, others too. So I don't know if it'd be worth turning off your video just to try to
conserve some bandwidth. Is that any better? Can you hear me better?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Yeah, sorry with the storm coming in. I'm hoping that my internet holds out. All right, well, let's start. So the program started in April of 2020, as I'm sure everyone remembers that that time. I was working with CEDO at the Resource and Recovery Center at that time, and we were getting many phone calls from different businesses that were in the process of opening back up, and they were looking at how they could do that safely. It was such a time of confusion, to say the least. Everyone was looking for the right kind of answers. So CEDO, with their work with the local businesses, was looking for ways that they could assist in some way, and sought money from the state in order to create a program that they could provide both the technical assistance from an expert as well as some funding to make those improvements to the facilities. And we were able to provide some HEPA units as well. We contracted with CX Associates to provide the technical assistance and expertise. The program was split into a few different parts. The one part was providing the technical assistance. So the way the program was structured was the businesses or organizations applied. The ventilation improvement program group, which consisted of CEDO, Burlington Electric, and CX Associates, they would meet to review the applications and select those that they thought had the best need, as well as served the most amount of public. And then those applications were, once they were selected, then CX Associates went to their facilities and conducted an assessment in order to see what would be the best kinds of improvements for their facilities to make, taking into account the kinds of businesses that they are, which is important and something that a lot of businesses don't get, which is tailored advice that can really help them specifically. So then after those assessments were given, those who were able to fund these projects on their side with some sort of match, and if the project seemed like it was a good fit for $10,000, it was really going to make a difference, and not just upgrading something that wasn't really going to make a ventilation difference. So then once the businesses met with contractors, the contractors were able to provide scopes of work based on those assessments. And then the team met and looked at those scopes of work to make sure that what the contractors were proposing to do was both cost effective and efficient. And then those were approved by the team and moved forward. And then the work was performed. So that was kind of the way that folks moved through this program. And also, as an aside, we conducted a webinar with CX Associates just to educate the general public and sort of try to provide like wider benefit to folks and just get the message out there to even more people who weren't selected to receive an assessment. Here are the list of businesses and organizations that were assisted. As you'll see, some received the assessments, they all received the assessments, some received HEPA units out of that assessment, and then some received funding towards those projects from the assessments. Here are our final budget reporting measures. The top line is the technical assistance, so the money that was set aside to pay CX Associates. The second line is the purchase of the HEPA filters and units that were distributed. And the third line is the funding that went towards the projects and the contractors. And the last line here is our pre-award and award admin, so our admin funds. Here are a few of our project photos. As you can see, we tried to target businesses and facilities that had a high need and saw a lot of public. So preschools at that time, there was a lot of concern around young children and whether or not they could contract and spread COVID and the dangers associated. And so preschools were highly targeted, as well as some of our other local establishments that had opened up and wanted to do so in the safest and most responsible manner that they could. Some of the challenges that we saw was that it was hard to ask the businesses and organizations to put their own money towards the projects when they had so many competing priorities during COVID. It just, while ventilation and their HVAC systems were important to them, there were just so many other problems and competing priorities that it sort of just seemed tough for them to put ventilation at the forefront. And it also showed us some of the infrastructure in Burlington and just how important this work is, and what kind of needs are out there. We have pretty large buildings with large systems, and especially when you consider the owner versus rental rate, there's a lot that contributes to the infrastructure of these buildings that I learned a lot about. So thank you for your time. I'll take any questions you might have.
Thanks so much, Chanel. And again, members of the public, feel free to jump in now, but Marcella, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Chanel, for the presentation on the project. I really just wanted to add a couple of comments to what Chanel was saying. As you could see, more than half the organizations, I think, that were assisted with that program were non-profits. And it was really instrumental in allowing a number of places to kind of reopen through the pandemic and feel assured that what they were, getting technical assistance on ventilation at that time was really important, and feeling assured that services were able to be provided to some of the most vulnerable in the community. We used it at the Community Resource Center. The VFW post reference was actually for the Community Resource Center, so it enabled us to get good technical assistance there when we opened the Community Resource Center, and served an awful lot of people at a fairly early stage of the pandemic. And I also just wanted to give a shout out to my colleagues in CEDO. This funding was all state level CDBG COVID funding, and I guess the Grant and Finance Department division within CEDO, and Gillian, myself, and led by Katie Kinston at that time, did a lot of additional work to bring this funding into the city. And I just kind of want to recognize my colleagues in that. It was a lot of extra work to bring this funding through, but it provided supports to an awful lot of folks in Burlington. So thank you, colleagues.
Job well done. Joe or Sarah, did you have any thoughts or questions? You're on mute, Sarah, but I see you shaking your head now. Great.
I'm also good. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for that. I think we don't need to take any action, anything, right, in terms of this being a public hearing. That was probably properly warned. So I think we're good to go. Thank you both for your presentations and being here with us. Next on our agenda is a presentation from UVM, and I believe we've got Dakota and Sam. Hi. Thanks for joining us.
Hi.
Hey, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now.
Fantastic. You just got a little bit of more insight into community development programs.
Yeah, fascinating. I love it. Doing great things. Makes me happy. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'll let you two take it away.
Thank you.
I assume everyone can see my screen now.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, first, let me just say thank you so much for having us. We're really excited at the opportunity to share with you all. My name is Dakota Walker. I'm here with my colleague, Sam Powers. We're speaking on behalf of a research group that we're part of that's looking at housing affordability solutions through property tax reform. And so we're just going to share a little bit of what we've learned over the past few months as viable options for Burlington. So more specifically, I'm going to start off with a little discussion on land value taxation as a revenue neutral shift from conventional property tax. Sam is going to talk about second home ownership here in Burlington and the revenue potential of second home taxation for funding affordable housing. And then we're going to conclude with a few recommended actions we have for the City Council to consider forwarding these conversations. So I don't think I need to stress much that Burlington is in the midst of a severe housing affordability crisis. And obviously the factors leading up to that outcome are very complex, but it's often told in this story where we have a rising population here in Burlington leading to growing demand. We have a falling and very stagnant supply of new housing here in Burlington. And as a result, we've seen median sale prices almost double in just the last few years. But what's often left out of the conversation is a growing portion of demand that's coming from speculative interest. And so we have numbers on this here in Burlington that in just the past few years, the percentage of homes that are bought by investors for speculative purposes has really surged, and it now comprises 17% of all purchases. So land value taxation has been proposed as a solution to the housing affordability crisis, and it really takes aim at that speculative demand portion that I spoke about. And so to understand the difference between land value taxation with a conventional property tax system that we have here, I want to emphasize that a property is in fact comprised of two very different values. So you have the improvement value of a site, which is any result of private investment on the part of a landowner, for example, building a home. And then you have the land value, which you can think of in terms of just the kind of underlying desirability of a location. It's the result of the community around that parcel, making it a desirable place. It's the result of public investment. And so on the right here, we can imagine these two parcels of equal size on the right with a house, on the left empty, to understand some of the differences between these tax systems. So with a conventional property tax, most of the tax would fall on the parcel on the right here. Whereas with the land value tax, because they're in the same location with the same size, you'd actually see an equal tax burden for both of those parcels. So the parcel on the left there would face a steep increase in their taxes. And it's going to encourage them to either develop or to sell to somebody who would like to develop. But as a result too, when they do choose to develop, they wouldn't face a tax penalty from developing. On the right, you'd see apartment buildings like this one who are providing housing services to the city would face a decrease in their tax bill burden in this case. And furthermore, if they continue maintaining their building or want to continue improving it, they're not going to also face tax penalties for doing so. So we did a preliminary study on the implications of land value tax here in Burlington, Vermont. Based on some of the limitations on the study, I want to just emphasize that we're really speaking about general trends here, not exact outcomes. But we looked at these two scenarios. So you have the land value tax like I was talking about, and then a split rate tax, which is more often implemented. And you can think of it as a kind of hybrid between the two systems, where you're still taxing improvement value to some degree, but most of that tax is falling on the land value. And so the results of our study seem to imply that it would in fact encourage development to happen and discourage speculation by making land expensive to continue holding on to, making it disincentivizing people from just holding on to land, doing nothing with it. On the right here, you can see the far right of this chart, those facing the highest increases in their tax burden are different forms of vacant land, residential, commercial, industrial vacant land. So again, encouraging them to either develop or sell to somebody who is interested in developing. Interesting to note too that next highest would be seasonal home uses. And then on the far left of the graph here, we see that most residential uses would on average face a decrease in their tax burden, especially so for very land efficient uses like triplexes and duplexes, but even so for single family homes on average. And so I want to also emphasize with this chart that what I'm not showing here is that in fact these three uses on the left comprise the vast majority of all parcels here in Burlington. So while a lot of these categories look like increases in taxes, in fact most people would be in these categories with decreases in their taxes. So we also looked at this spatially, and the results of that seem to suggest that this would be a socially just and progressively distributed tax shift. So using census block data, we see that neighborhoods that have a median income less than 60,000 would on average have a 5.1% decrease in their tax burden, whereas those higher income brackets would face a slight increase in their taxes. And based on the results of Sam's work that we're going to look at next on where second homes are here in Burlington, looking at those parcels, we see that on average, they would face a 7% increase in their tax burden. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sam. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dakota. Yeah, I just wanted to first define what a second home is. The way we're talking about second homes, they are underused or unused residential properties that are not owner occupied. So short-term rentals and vacation homes, as well as seasonal homes, all fall under this category. And in Burlington, just to overview kind of the housing stock in Burlington, we see a large percentage, around 60% of the housing stock is actually renters. And I mention this because renters are disproportionately impacted by second homes and the presence of second homes in a community, because second homes both decrease the available housing stock within that community and raise prices of housing. Different from Vermont in many respects, because Vermont actually overall has a more owner-occupied skew. And so we actually see Burlington is very unique in that it has a higher than average renter burden and a lot of renters. And second homes exacerbate this problem even more by, again, decreasing the available housing stock and driving up the prices for real estate. And renters bear the brunt of these effects. And in our study, we estimated very conservatively estimated 4% of housing in Burlington is under the umbrella of second homes, which is around $180 million of taxable value, which I mentioned because, for example, with a 13% increase in the taxes of just second homes, which is a very small subset of residential properties, the city of Burlington could raise an additional $500,000 of annual revenue in perpetuity to fund affordable housing projects. But that's just a for instance. We're not suggesting any specific solutions right now. What we're asking, as per Resolution 6.05, which was recently approved by the City Council, we want to suggest some specific outcomes that we would like to see from this committee and from the City Council at large. Firstly, a commissioning of a formal study on property tax reform in Burlington. We know of partner organizations that Burlington can work with to do this study. In addition, we would also like to see a commissioning of a report on estimated second home ownership by the assessor's office. Our study was really limited because it was from outsiders who had a limited data set and we did not benefit from the institutional knowledge of the assessor's office. And finally, we would just like the City Council and CDNR to facilitate a public discussion and around housing needs and property tax reform alternatives to kind of get the ball rolling and thinking about ways in which we can reform our property tax system in Burlington. So with that, thank you so much, and we would love to take your questions.
Great, thank you, Dakota and Sam. Again, happy to have folks from the public weigh in, although I don't know if Dakota and Sam were expecting that, but also Sarah and Joe. Joe, just to check, do you have a time when your flight's leaving that you needed to, just so I'm aware?
Soon-ish, but I'm okay right now.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Sarah.
I've got lots of questions and in fact would love to talk offline with some of the folks. But just two quick ones. Did you do any analysis I mean, 70% of our property tax revenue is under the auspices of education funding. So it's very controlled by the state, to put it mildly. So did you do any analysis of sort of how that interfaces with the discussion that you're looking at?
No, I can't say we did much. I mean, of course, I want to just reemphasize that the purpose of this study is really to try to point enough, show enough evidence that this is something that we want to at least study further. And I think we can come together as a community and decide what questions we want to ask for that further study. I think if I understand your question correctly too, I think this would fall in the domain of something that would require a charter change. So that is something to think about.
Yeah, and because Vermont's obviously like a Dillon's rule state where we have to kind of comply with most state regulations unless we get state approval for that. We could also see part of like that other 30% of revenue capture be land value based. So there is a possibility, and of course this is like way down the road, but there is a possibility of having a portion of our tax system in Burlington be dedicated to land value taxation, given the fact that the state does control a fair amount of assessment practices. Yeah.
Okay. This is more a question for Brian. Have we did pass a resolution. We had intended to do a tax study, and it's been sort of sitting on the shelf. And I wonder, Brian, if you've had any more recent conversations with Catherine about this. And I guess I'm saying to Council Hightower, maybe we should put this on our agenda, an update on that study discussion for another meeting.
I would say that the work that the city is engaged in with I'm going to forget the name of the group, but they're really looking at a number of issues around the relationship between taxation and land uses, I guess. And it's not as much focused on, shall we say, tax fairness and progressivity of taxation. Really, it's really focused more on the impact of various land use policies on the city's revenue stream. So that's a piece of work that Megan Tuttle is overseeing. And as far as taking the council resolution that was passed, I want to say, was it last spring, maybe, about taxation, and it hasn't gotten much attention, to be frank.
Well, that's what I assumed, and I certainly understand that, but we might want to raise that discussion again and see if we can get an update. I also just had one more question for the folks from UVM. In your analysis of sort of potential developable land, did you do that, or I mean, how did you get to a sense about underdeveloped land in the city?
Yeah, so we relied entirely on the assessor's office distinction of different land uses. So they describe different lots that they are considering residential vacant, commercial vacant, and industrial vacant. And I think the assumption there is that anytime you'd be in one of those categories, you are developable. So that's not, for example, like tax exempt land or anything like that. But as far as like specific quantities of land or areas, we didn't look into that. No.
So no assessment of impediments to developing it. It's just that it's vacant.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't know, I know that Joe's been much more involved in some of the more like fairness side. There was a group that met for a while that I know, but I don't know, Dakota and Sam, if you know this background, but we recently just had an assessment that I would say didn't go great. And so I think this is interesting just in terms of like, to the extent that sometimes the assessment value, it seems to be somewhat random and not very it doesn't feel very fair to folks either. Something that's a bit more standard as an underlying is certainly an interesting way to think about doing it for the next, if not the next one, then the one after that. Maybe we're talking in 20-year cycles, but Joe, I don't know if you had thoughts that you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is certainly something that we should be looking more closely at. I think, you know, what I'm seeing here is that we don't have perfect data, and so to really be able to figure out what direction we should take with this and then what the true impact would be, we would need that data, and I think the state has a role to play in that. And I would also like to see us, I know we had talked about public assets potentially helping us with the property tax analysis, or some former folks who used to work at public assets. And I think it might be worth us having preliminary conversations with the Center for Property Tax Reform as well. So appreciate you all making that recommendation.
Yeah, and if I could just speak to the fairness and the assessment practices for a second. Land value taxation specifically is actually more, I think it's in some ways very different from how they currently assess. Because as Zariah was saying, or sorry, Councilor Hightower, I apologize.
Zariah is totally fine.
I'm sorry. As you were saying though, you know, it can be somewhat arbitrary and very difficult to appeal. And land value taxation is very spatially based and based on surrounding characteristics. And I think that makes it a lot fairer and a lot clearer as to kind of what the value of properties are. So I just thought that was a pertinent point.
Right. And also, I mean, I think we worry less about this in single family strong markets where, you know, it's your home, so you're going to invest however much you can or want in it because you're living in it. But I think definitely on the multi-unit and renter kind of based buildings also has a disincentive for like properly, because it's like, oh, look, it's falling apart. This should be a low cost building. I had a few more specific questions, which was how you got to the 4% being a conservative estimate, just in terms of if that's even based as our like reason to look into this further. So maybe just that first.
Yeah, absolutely. So, oh gosh, so many ways to talk about this. So overall, statewide, you know, there's around 17% of homes are classified as probably second homes. The data is still difficult because of the different classifications of the Census Bureau and the state and individual towns, but around 17%. And in Burlington, based on the American Community Surveys data, which is where the 17% number comes from, it's around 0.5%. And that's obviously a lot lower. And I'm incredibly skeptical of that number, just based on the fact that there are, you know, the number that they have, I think is like 67. Just based on the number of places at, you know, Star Farm Road or beach, or yeah, and based on the just number of you know, short-term rentals in the area, which is like 200 something normally. I'm highly skeptical of that number. And to speak to the methodology, we used specific characteristics of the property taxes and the certificates of compliance, the rental certificates of compliance. So to speak to it really quickly, we basically looked at all the residential properties and we said, okay, all of the properties that have declared homestead obviously don't count because those people live here year round. And then all of the properties that have rental certificates of compliance are rented out, and so they wouldn't count as second homes. And then we had all of these properties that paid non-homestead tax. And so we looked at those and really, I was in conversation with the state and the state Department of Taxes, and there's no real good way to tell whether or not someone actually lives there year round, unless you have you know, access to more detailed property tax records. And that was kind of a lot more difficult for me to do in a short period of time. So we basically used the declared mailing addresses. And if they were outside of Burlington, we counted those as second homes, which is what the actual like Department of Taxes was suggesting, because there is a specific portion of the grand list that has like ownership codes, but those are pretty out of date and not frequently refreshed. If sorry if that was too detailed, but that was where the conservative number came from, is all of those that declared that had a mailing address in some place other than Vermont or someplace other than Burlington.
Got it. And then the one other question that I had was that it disproportionately affects renters. And are you just saying that because we're a rental heavy city, or is there something else about who you think has second homes that is cutting into the, like what those buildings tend to look like, or characteristics they share with the rental market?
Yeah, so I think in terms of if we can think about kind of the macroeconomic effects of second homes, we see a general reduction in housing supply, which means less availability, less affordability of housing. And then when there is outside investment, especially from places that have like a different kind of economic like homeostasis, if that makes sense, like San Francisco, for example, a lot of people like came from California or Massachusetts, right, and had more money, and so that actually skews, the real estate prices in that area. And so increased real estate prices means that oftentimes the assessment value is up, and so taxes go up, and also landlords are able to charge more, essentially, for that property, and they have to charge more in some circumstances because the value of their property has risen by virtue of the fact that there are there's more speculation and more second homes in that area. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I would counter argument say that affects both first time home buyers who aren't currently on the ladder as much as renters, maybe more renters because there's more renters as people in Burlington, but not necessarily disproportionately.
Right. Yeah. I think I was, in terms of renters as a class, I think I was just saying, because homeowners, include first-time homeowners and people who are trying to own their home for the first time. But I would also say that it actually might make it, more difficult for first-time homeowners. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's just another negative impact of second homes, is it makes it more difficult for first-time homeowners to actually get a home, because it makes homes more expensive and it limits the amount of housing available. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. Like you heard, I think we've started to have not this specific discussion, but kind of a discussion on fairness, both maybe with the reappraisal, and then also I think even before that, when Brian was still on the council back then, when we had a conversation around, which I'm sure you also read about, whether or not to have a system of taxation, just municipal taxation for homes that have over a certain value. And I feel like this is a great counter proposal to that conversation of how to make our taxes system a little bit more progressive. So yeah, appreciate you all taking the initiative. And I think to Sarah's point, I think we should put something on the agenda to talk through this again.
Zariah, we have a few hands up. We have Lars, Stephen, and Brian Pine.
Oh, my apologies. I didn't have the participant list up. Let's do them in that order.
Should I go?
Yes, please.
Okay. Hello, my name's Lars Doucet. I am a land value tax researcher and mass appraisal researcher. I was invited by one of your constituents. And I just want to back up the proposal by Dakota and Sam here. I think they gave a great presentation. The only thing I would add to their presentation is one of the merits from the progressivity of land value tax is it cannot be passed on to tenants. And by that, I don't mean in theory, I mean empirically. I present as evidence my book, Land is a Big Deal. The thesis is that land is a big deal. And part 3 is an empirical literature review of all the studies of whether land value tax is passed on to tenants. And the research from the literature is absolutely empirically conclusive that it is not. So that is a very unintuitive finding that a lot of people have a hard time believing. But the evidence from the economic literature is extremely clear there. You raise taxes on cigarettes and oil, that gets passed on to the end user, but land is a really special category because we can't make any more of it. And because of that, it's the one thing you can tax without getting less of it. And I'll spare you the theoretical basis behind it, but we just empirically observe that prices for tenants don't go up when you tax land, which makes it particularly advantageous from a progressivity perspective when you're thinking about public policy. Also, municipalities tend to underestimate exactly how much revenue it can raise. I estimated that in the book, the total value of all the land in America at about 44 trillion, which is much larger than most of the values you'll find if you Google. And also that a lot of other cities and municipalities are currently studying split rate property tax. There's a proposal right now in Detroit that's going through. There's some interest in Colorado. I was just at a Property Tax Institute meeting down in Texas, proposing it to the comptroller there. So there's a lot of people who are asking this question. I have some Norwegian politicians who have been talking to me about it. So I think there's a lot of growing interest in this. And then there's a lot of Nobel laureates who, if you ask them what is the best tax, they will say land value tax. So if you have any empirical question, I can't tell you about Burlington specifically, but if there's any questions Dakota and Sam can't answer about land value tax literature in general and its merits for progressivity and efficiency, and also any questions you have about fairness and appraisals, because that's a very good question. What good is the tax if the appraisal is unfair? That's literally my day job, so I can answer any of those questions too.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Lars, for your additions. And let me just take the second to say I am a huge fan. I've read a lot of your work. I hope to read your book sometime soon. So really excited to have you here, and definitely want to just second that. Yeah, if any of these questions aren't answered adequately by us, please chime in, Lars.
Okay, I'll mute myself now. Thank you very much. You've done a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lars. What a great addition to that presentation. And go ahead, Stephen, and then Brian.
Hi, everybody. I guess I got a couple of points. I'm really grateful Lars showed up because he added a lot of weight to the argument. My part in the committee was to study affordability in the study group. And I just wanted to throw a couple of data points at you. In 1967, it took less than a half a year of income to buy a house in Vermont. In 2019, it took 6.4 years of income. For tenants, the change was that in what was it? I think it was 1980. If you paid $242 for an apartment and your rent went up with your rate of wage inflation, in 2019, you'd have been paying $285. In reality, you were paying $1,213. I'm speaking median incomes, median housing. The thrust of my argument is that a lot more has gone wrong than just the failure to build housing. We are on the cusp, and we can look at this in terms of the outside hedge fund advisors, hedge fund people buying properties. We are on the cusp of a major wealth transfer process. Been going on since 1973, but it's getting a lot worse. The land tax promises to help mitigate that, making it much more difficult for people who just want to speculate on the value of land, hold it, not provide any services to the community, and then sell it again for profit. Will make it really hard for those people to be motivated. Yes, and there was another point, but I guess I lost it. So
We'll happily come back to you, Stephen, if you do remember it. So no pressure right now.
okay.
Awesome. Brian, and then I know Barbara texted me. So Barbara, if you want to speak, just feel free to raise your hand.
I just wanted to thank the group that convened on this. Stephen and I talked a few times about the project while it was underway. I would just note that the voters of Burlington, by a decent margin, approved a question in 1987-ish, so a long time ago. But it was the anti-speculation tax, and it was literally a tax on speculation that we brought to the voters, and then proceeded to the State House, where it was defeated, and the legislature said, no, we can do a speculation tax on farms because we already do that through the land gains tax. So cows are more important than people is really what they said, ultimately. But anyway, that was the history that I think would be worth noting, that we attempted to address the speculation issue through a disincentive to speculate, because rental properties were being purchased, a fresh coat of paint, maybe some new carpeting and some other minor amenities, and then it was flipped for a considerable increase. And if that happened several times over a few years, property values were jacking up rents as a result. So that speculation was really happening, and it was very well documented by CEDO, actually. And it was a group of citizen activists that pushed for the question to go before the voters, and then won approval, and then lost at the State House. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for that addition. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add too, even the land gains tax, from my understanding, has recently gone through a process of changing the definition of eligible land. So even in areas outside of Burlington now, I believe you have to have subdivided that land, and it can no longer be in any area where they consider it like a developing area. So I think, unfortunately, even our one means of trying to tax those kind of gains is getting stripped out. So
and for a long time, I think, like, recently we've kind of been complacent and not realized that we're kind of benefiting from right, like the land gains tax, and also in circumstances like across the United States, people are buying up like mobile home parks and stuff like that, but there are actually quirky state mechanisms that have actually prevented that from happening in Vermont specifically. So we've kind of dropped the ball in terms of preparing ourselves for, like what Stephen is saying, and like what Brian has said, kind of this larger picture of increased speculation and interest in real estate. So yeah, thank you so much, Brian.
So I guess the point I was trying to make is very simple. Property taxes began a way for towns to fund themselves back pre-colonial time. Well, okay, colonial times. And they gradually got pared down away from collecting taxes on rings and plateware down to only just the house and the land. So it's a very long-standing tradition in Vermont. And naturally enough, people are very accustomed to it. People don't like change. They're not going to want to see. They're going to have all kinds of questions that go, why are we even talking about this? Why do we have to change this? As a discussion about assessment brought forward, there's an article in the New York Times which documents how low-income people have higher assessments on their property than wealthy people for the amount of value that's actually in that building and that property. In other words, just the need to assess the value of a house is a burden, and it's a wealth justice issue. So for that reason, and for all the other reasons that we've talked about today, I think it's very important for us to try to break the shell of convention, break our consciousness of status quo, and say, you know what, we can do better. We can do better. And we need to do better, because if we do not do better, a lot of people are going to suffer a lot. The wealthy in our society are doing great. The poor in our society are getting in worse and worse and worse condition. We need to do something.
Thanks, Stephen. Barbara, saw you turn your video on.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm super excited to hear this topic. My 23-year-old son and his best friend have been trying to tell me that this is the way Burlington should do its property taxes. So I've listened to this from them for at least a year, and they have convinced me that this is the right thing, both for equity purposes, and it just makes sense financially for the city, and it'll increase density, all the things that we want. So I asked him, my son, to look at your presentation, and he did, and he says that it's pretty much what he has been telling me, with one additional difference. He and his friend Oscar think that when somebody has multiple apartments or multiple rental buildings, that there should be a progressive tax on each additional housing unit that they own. So the property tax that say somebody owns, we have people in Burlington who own 500 apartments, another person owns 700 apartments, that they would pay a tax based on the cumulative value of all those properties. And that would free up a lot of those properties to become owner occupied, whether they're, 1, 2, 3 bedroom apartments or condominiums, but it would change it from being primarily a renter market to an owner occupied market, and still multi-density. So I wondered if that concept might be something that you would consider as you continue to build this concept out. Thank you.
And I can also touch on that, sorry, maybe before you go, Sam, which I know is that, because we've had a lot of conversations about rental registration, or not registration, but landlord registration, which has just become very difficult to do because so many of the apartments are owned by entities that are separate from the person. And we haven't found a good way around that yet. I don't know if Brian has something, or Sam, to add to that, but I know that we struggle with that as a city, even just in terms of like, when you get dinged for one apartment, you should get dinged for like across your apartments as like somebody who doesn't maintain their housing stock, but we've not found a good way to do that yet. So I'd imagine this would be even more complicated.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, I'm just super excited. So many people are chiming in, and so many people are willing to kind of think about this. We went to the statewide housing conference, and I was really I was really, oh gosh, disappointed. That's the word. At the fact that there was barely any talk of taxation, which is like one of the primary policy levers of like every government. And there was barely any discussion of taxation. So I'm so glad that kind of our local policy leaders and community are excited for this and excited for property tax reform. I think it's really cool. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Lars, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or did you have a separate question?
Yeah, just a couple follow-ups to some things some people had said, so one of the things is, I think your 4%, like, people who own multiple things, was that your stat of whatever? One of the reasons it's probably also undercounted is, did you just count the number of owners that had LLC in their name?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
That's a common way people do it, is they're just like, and that's like even a really like crude method, but just that will catch people who are not humans, who are in fact corporations, who own houses, probably not because the corporation intends to, settle down and start a family. Basically, what I wanted to bring up is on the topic of assessments. So I'm a mass appraisal researcher. This is like my bread and butter. I wanted to offer you a couple tips. Practically speaking, I don't know anything about the Burlington, assessor's office, and I don't want to preemptively slag them off or make any assumptions about them whatsoever. Maybe they're absolutely state of the art, and probably they are. But just a couple of tips in case you're not doing these already. One, landlord registry would be great if you can get it. I don't know, is Vermont a real estate non-disclosure state or not? Does anyone know?
We have that registry already in Burlington.
Oh, fabulous. I'm used to working in places like Texas where it's real estate non-disclosure and we got to buy data from TransUnion, do all this other stuff. The assessments are only as good as their data. And every time land value tax has been implemented somewhere and it's later been repealed, it's been because of a taxpayer revolt when the assessor's office went like 5 years without doing a reassessment. So having accurate assessments is not only going to be important for advocating to your population that you want this policy, because you're going to have to be able to show who wins and who loses, and show that overall more people on the progressive end of, you know, like that lower incomes win, and it's a broad base. It's good for everyone, you know, overall. And that it's mostly people who are doing things like holding on to parking lots downtown or whatever that are losing. You know, you need to do the assessments first and make sure they're very accurate to do that. I can give you plenty of tips on appraisal accuracy. Maybe your assessment office is already up to snuff, and that would be great. Another thing is, if you have a landlord registry and a rental registry, so you know what everyone's paying in rent, the more data your assessment office has, it doesn't matter. Like, even if they're, you know, a little bit behind in their methods, if they have better data, they'll always get better results. And another thing is, if you have any city-owned land that can, or city-owned property, and if you don't, if you could acquire some, that's additional data you'll always have access to, right? If the city just owns a house in every neighborhood that it rents out, now you have an accurate market value data point everywhere in the city, which helps you establish the value of land for your assessor's office, you know. And that's short of like 100% public housing, but just even having it just for the data is valuable enough, because accurate assessments and accurate mass appraisal is kind of a linchpin of this. But it doesn't have to be perfect, because you're already assessing the value, and even a crude approach can still fix a lot of these inequities. And but most of, whenever you do see a study that shows that property tax or land value tax is regressive, it's not because of the policy. It'll almost certainly be because they haven't updated their assessments in 5 years or something like that, or there's a chronic inequity you can easily point to and easily fix in their assessments.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I would just add too that, like, in our own research, we did come across lots of anomalies with land value assessments. And one of the reasons is there's not necessarily an incentive to get the land value portion of it correct, right? Because they're just focused on that total value. So that's not necessarily spelling a problem for fairness in property taxation yet. But it's quite easy to understand where there are anomalies, because it's so locationally determined. You know, you can't have two parcels right next to each other with a huge difference in that assessed value. So it's something we would need to look through.
Right. Just print a map and you'll see where the sore spots are, right? There's Regrid has done a Detroit assessment gauge. I recommend you look it up. It's you know, they're working on like trying to help Detroit move to this kind of policy, and you can just easily see where the inequities are. And like, the basic principle is that side-by-side properties should be the same land per square foot. That's an easy check, right? And so these kind of tests are very objective. And so you can test whether your current assessor's office has an accurate land valuation.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, just I'm sort of, we actually had a study committee looking at our whole appraisal process, which we waited way too long. I'm an advocate of much more frequent appraisals, but I'm sort of saying this publicly, and I'm going to suggest to Brian that maybe Lars might be somebody who could contribute to that, the conversation of that working group, because the working group is supposed to be looking at our mass appraisal process, which, as Councilor Hightower said, did not go well, and suggest some improvements to that. So I'm just making that connection.
I'd be happy to, and be happy to forward you to anyone else in case, you know.
Awesome. And Joe, is that group still meeting?
Yeah, I think, as far as I know, I think we're expecting the final summary of their work soon. Right, I know they were meeting as recently as the fall, so.
Yeah,
I would
and
have to
maybe
do some
not to throw a
checking up
wrench in
on
their
that.
game, but maybe we forward this report to them just to throw a wrench in their game.
Well, I think the conversation that Lars brought up around the importance of the accuracy of the data is really where you got to start. And, you know, I think we lack some of that. And we clearly lacked it because we waited so very long in the last reappraisal. And so I hope they come up with some suggestions about how to deal with that going forward.
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, go rolling reappraisals and in-house reappraisals. Yeah, that's not my area. We're not at the ad hoc reappraisal committee, but yeah, I'm also extremely supportive of that. I think, yeah, echoing data is super important. Yeah, and reappraisal. Yeah.
To give you some perspective, you're in a much better place than a lot of other jurisdictions. If you're not a real estate non-disclosure state and you've already got a rental registry in the works, whatever you've got is probably head and shoulders above a lot of the counties I work with, where they're forbidden by law to look at what a house sold for instance. That's quite difficult to work with.
Vermont actually, because of our property transfer tax and the publishing of that data, actually does have a really good data source. There's probably more to it, but the data source, I think I'd personally love to see us figure out how to dig into, and this is a nuance, is there's the homestead credit and the fact that, for instance, in Burlington, almost 70% of the homeowners get effectively a rebate from the state on their property taxes. So you've got to marry that data. And that's one of the things that I'd hoped when we passed the resolution, whenever last February, that we would try to dissect that for Burlington, because that's income based, and although it's different, it creates an amount of fairness, but we don't know how to marry that data.
Yeah, it's income based. Sorry.
Getting off.
Oh yeah, I was just saying, census block data, I mean, I think could be a potential use, right? Then for homestead. I don't know. Sorry.
I am going to move us to wrap up of this discussion, just because I know at least it looks like Joe's getting ready to go, and I know Christine's got a harder stop as well. And we do just have one more thing on our agenda, which may end up mostly being a discussion between Sarah and I. Thank you, Dakota, Sam, everybody who weighed in, Barbara, Lars, and others. Appreciate this. Yeah, this discussion, and obviously a lot of interest and a lot of things to think through in the future. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you both. But yeah, and I think that was Joe signing off. But we were going to at least talk through, and I think we're not going to get very far, so maybe we can just plan for next time, what we heard from some of the feedback from the groups. And I think Joe at least wasn't at either one of the ones that you and I were at, where just one counselor was there. But I might just quickly turn to summarizing the meeting I was at, which the notes are now on our CDNR website. Sarah, I don't know if you've got notes.
I did not do notes. I apologize. I could have, but I didn't.
That is okay. Maybe you can just add to what I'm about to say then. Sorry, I'm turning to it. Which there were two meetings that I went to. One of them was the November 30th meetings, which I went to by myself. So neither one of the other CDNR committee members were there. Marcella was there. And that is, Marcella, maybe you could expand on what that group is and who they are, and then I can expand on the what feedback we got.
Yeah, that group is it goes by different names at different times of the year, but it's essentially all of the folks who work in outreach around Burlington or Chittenden County with people who are experiencing homelessness, and a lot of their work is focused with folks who are unsheltered, but also people who are sheltered in various places as well. So it's also kind of formally part of the point in time count committee as well. It's where we sort of do our outreach planning for the point in time committee, but it kind of grew out of that, and we realized that there was a need to provide a place for those people who are doing really important work to convene and discuss.
Got it. Thanks for that. And this may overlap with some of what you heard, Sarah, just because, of course, there were a lot of city staff in that meeting. The meeting you went to was city staff. But I tried to kind of bucket the things which one of the things that we heard was the What is working is that parts of our ordinance right now that may seem arbitrary or allow for things that are arbitrary actually shows some flexibility, which allows staff to have some discretion in how they handle things. And so getting rid of all arbitrariness, while it may seem like a good goal, could actually make it less humane as you're trying to deal with really difficult and really unique situations. Other things that are going well is people are just, I think, really proud of our teams that are working on this, from the CSL team to street outreach to coordinated entry. And then some of the other things, park ranger program works well. What's not working? I'll just go to that, which the biggest one we heard was the nowhere to go, need camping, and folks also pointed to car camping, that's not just, that some of the temporary situations are actually car related. But that was a big refrain of, you can't go, we don't know where you can go, but you can't stay here. The no amenities, so garbage, bathrooms, sharp containers, storage, car camping. Just that cleanup is very problematic, expensive, dangerous, difficult for almost everyone involved, traumatic. And then some of the other things that weren't working was client confusion, would ideally be a multi-city and town effort, lack of transitional housing, flex funding, fatigue, lack of understanding. So there's a lot of misconceptions out there, that kind of thing. So that's some of what we heard in the other meeting, in that meeting. Then there was one other meeting, which is the Chittenden County
Homeless Alliance.
something. Yeah, Chittenden County Homeless Alliance. Thank you. And go ahead, Sarah.
Actually, before you move on, I would thank you for doing the notes. And I would say, in fact, what you're reporting was very similar to what I heard. I went to a smaller meeting of effectively city staff that was involved. So Sarah Russell coordinated it, and primarily staff from DPW and the Parks Department, and Lacey Ann Smith from the Police Department. And so I would, briefly looking over all your notes, I'd say I heard very similar responses, that they liked having some flexibility. And we didn't talk a lot about the specific proposed policy. I think we really focused on just the strain and the lack of resources that is frustrating them, and the burden it's putting on the city of Burlington and its staff. You know, we have so few people dedicated to this issue, even though we have the support services from the not-for-profits, and that's the group that we heard from, the bigger group. But it doesn't deal with, their focus is on the city staff focuses on the immediacy of how to deal with the situation today on public land and all of the surrounding issues. They're not there to deal with finding housing for somebody or supporting them or getting them into the coordinated entry and, you know, all of the other wraparound services, or I don't know if they're wraparound, but services. And it's just what a stressor that is for really a very small staff that all have other jobs effectively. And I think a big frustration that why isn't anybody else helping us with this, I guess would be the, you know, sort of sense about it.
Mm-hmm. And then I'm just going to quickly summarize the other meeting, just because I get the actual summary statistics, which I'll let people read through the responses, the Chittenden County Homeless Alliance. But I think we also specifically asked, just based on how the other two meetings went, if Burlington should have sanctioned or allowed camping areas, which is a little bit more specific than what we originally started talking about as a committee, which is a more broad, just non-allowance of camping. And just so folks know, we got 11 responses from that group, and 73% or 8 people said yes, 2 people or 18% said maybe, and 1 person said no. And I think there was also in that list on that question is like, how might your organization be able to support these changes? There was a pretty broad array. Some people were like, we do housing, we can't help you here. Whereas I think there was a good list of services. And one of the things I think that we definitely heard very strongly is like, you can't just say they're sanctioned camping without giving the same level of support to that as we're doing the pods. So just throwing that out there. Any other thoughts, Marcella? Oh,
no, I think we summarized it. Thanks.
Great.
I was just going to say, when I was talking to the staff group, and I asked them about the question of sanctioned camping, and it was similar response, which is good thought, but who's going to do it? How are we going to do it? You know, and if you look relatively to the resources spent on the pods, and that's more structured as it should be, but you know, you go back to the concept when during COVID, we let people camp at North Beach. That's the kind of thing you'd have to stand up, and how do we get there? And it doesn't have to be as formal as what we did say in 2020 or 21 at North Beach, but you still have all of the same issues. How do you deal with toilets and trash removal, and who does it, and whose job is it to do it, and how does it get paid for, and all of those questions.
We've got Joel and then Stephen, and that might be the end because we're gonna have to close.
Hi, Joel here. Well, the lighting is I'm new at this. I found the taxation discussion really interesting, but back to camping. I was unable to open the survey notes that are on the CDNR website. So, and I was just curious. I did open the public discussion notes, and I found those very useful. I would find them even more useful, I think, if you could sort of put the dates when these meetings happened and which groups, if maybe even which individuals spoke up, or which groups trended towards a certain viewpoint. I mean, you kind of, Soraya, you kind of summed it up, but I think those notes for people who can't make the meeting would be really useful if we could just sort of say, folks who are walking through campsites feel that this is important, or just to sort of clarify a little bit. So that's my dearest wish.
Great. Yeah. And I can go back through, especially because I think the PDF, I also couldn't open it from the site. So I just went back and looked at my Google form again. But I can name those things so that it's clear.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
What day?
Okay. Yeah. It's just good to know what groups are informing the discussion. Anyone can see who's on this discussion, and it's wonderfully transparent. And it's just helpful, I think, to people to see how things work. Yeah.
This is a question for Soraya.
Okay.
And it's a comment for everybody, but it was interesting. Certainly the Chittenden County Alliance Group, and I again met with a smaller group, but one of the observations was that all of the parties in the Alliance Group is large. They either do housing or social services. That's their bucket of activity. Now, some of them, if you would, specialize in working with people who are unhoused, so they focus on getting social services and housing to the individual. But an observation that came certainly from city staff, nobody specializes in camping. And I know that the group you met with, Soraya, that their focus is unhoused people who are camping, but it sort of dawned on me, not any one of them, that isn't what they do. They do one, either find housing for people or find social services for people. And so it sort of started speaking to me as a gap, because we've got so many campers. Who's on first around that issue? And right now it's been city staff people who aren't, that's only part of their job.
Yeah, I would, maybe I'm channeling my Paul Dragon a little bit by saying, yes, and like ultimately beyond the one or two people that it seems like may actually like truly permanently want to camp, like how much do you want people to focus on something that isn't a solution?
Well, and I agree with that, except we have this immediate problem of how do we manage it in between. And I think this is the pros and cons of, do we create a whole new ordinance to deal with something that should not be a permanent solution, or do we, and I'm just saying this is a rhetorical question, or do we focus on a more intermediate process to deal with what we've got on the problems we've got on hand, understanding that that should never be the long-term solution.
We are running out of time, Stephen, and then Noah.
So I think you have a non-problem. Maybe you would tell me that there are people complaining, oh, I don't want these people camping near my property, whatever. But I think nationally, the community of people who know people who camp advocate against congregation. Congregation is an example of congregation is what happened at Sears Lane. It's better if people are dispersed. If it's better for people to be dispersed, then all you have to do is let them camp where they want to camp. If you know where they are, you can go and help them, but you do not need a special bureaucracy. You might want to expand the street outreach people so that there are people, or maybe send some folks from CVOEO just to go out and check, because doing what you're doing now. As soon as you start trying to tighten this up, you're going to spend more money and you're going to have more trouble. Don't stir the hornet's nest. Try to make sure people get the services that they need where they are, and ignore them. Make sure that they're not doing anything illegal. Obviously, if there are crimes committed, you got to follow up, et cetera, et cetera. But if people are not making trouble, leave them alone.
Noah, you get the last word.
Oh, I apologize. Can you hear me all right?
Yes. You might want to speak up just a little though.
Of course. All I was going to say is that Lars Doucet from earlier asked me before I left to put out his contact information, and there's an open invite for anybody to reach out to him if you have any questions at all. This is definitely his passion project. So if you want to reach him, he's on Twitter. Just search Lars Doucet Twitter, or you can reach his email at lars.doucet@landisabigdeal.com.
Got it. Thanks so much. Great. Appreciate everyone for the lively discussion around this. Go ahead, Sarah. Last
Just
1 minute.
more. This is a minor follow-up with Stephen, but something that was said to me in 2 of my other meetings, that I really would like us to invite Scott and people from ComStat to come and talk to us about what they do, because Stephen makes a valid point, but the thing we hear the most in terms of neighbors in camping is how to deal with the drug use. We understand that not all unhoused people are drug users, but we have many camping sites with high amounts of drug use, and that's what becomes problematic. So, and they're kind of dealing with drug use generally, but we haven't had a discussion on how that program and their look at it relates to what we're seeing with some campers.
Great. We
I just
don't
want to
have
say
another.
that's an important question.
I did promise Christine that we would get out of here on
Yeah.
time because she has a hard stop, and I want to give her some transition time. I assume Sarah and Stephen you can have your keep chatting about that offline. And we don't have another meeting set, I don't believe, unless somebody corrects me now, but we'll figure that out offline for our next dates. I assume it'll be in January, just as we hit the end of the year.
Yeah, and January 15th, the state is lifting the virtual only policy. So we will have to do a hybrid meeting if it's after January 15th. So, but we can certainly schedule something. We'll talk Soraya offline.
Great. Thanks so much. Appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate the discussion, which I think has been valuable on all kinds of levels of hitting different parts of what is good, could be better about our housing and how folks are housed in Burlington. So appreciate everyone. Wish everybody a happy end of the year.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.